you are owning a bigger percentage of the company as your career grows. It increasingly becomes a gamble. You have to make intelligent guesses. So you have to do your own research about equity, evaluation, future potential of this company. As I was projecting future income at Databricks, I was like, I really believe in the mission of this company. I really believe that this company will do amazing.
Welcome to Tech Careers and Money Talk. I'm your host, Christopher Nelson. And today I want to answer one of the questions that's on many people's minds, which is, where should we start our career? Do we start at an early stage startup where there's a lot of opportunity, or do we start at a mature public company where we can grow our skills and also get equity compensation that's liquid right away? Today, we're going to talk with Ritendra Datta, who has grown his career working at Google and then Facebook, and now has taken his opportunity to trade time and talent at a pre-IPO company, Databricks. I want to dig into the conversation to help understand what helped him successfully grow his career from walking in as an intern to ultimately running teams of up to 200 people. The second half of the conversation, I want to take advantage of the fact that he is an AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning expert to understand how this is going to impact the workplace of the future. I know there's a lot of noise in the marketplace out there. AI is taking people's jobs. AI is going to replace people. I want to get to the truth and understand what he really thinks from his vantage point. I'm excited for everybody here to meet Ritendra today. Let's talk to him right now. Welcome to Tech Careers and Money Talk. I'm excited to introduce everyone today to Ritendra Datta. He's the head of applied AI at Databricks, but that's not where he started. He started coming out of school with a PhD in computer science and walked in the door of Google as an intern. Yes, you heard that, PhD to intern. 9 years later, left as a senior staff engineer to then go to Facebook to ultimately head up a 200-person team of reels and video recommendations. He has an amazing career story. He's also the voice that can help us understand what is the future of AI in the workplace going forward. I'm excited to introduce everybody today to Ritendra Datta. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for inviting me.
My pleasure. I mean, let's get right into it. I think that what sticks out in your story is you walk out, you've worked so hard to get a PhD, and then you walk in the door of Google as an intern. How did that feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was a poor graduate student. I was making I don't know, just about enough money to save a couple $100 every month after paying everything. So first the big jump was money related, which is wow, that's a lot of money. In 3 months I earned more than I used to earn as a grad student in a year, probably year and a half. And so financially this was a huge deal. But more importantly, I suddenly got exposed to a different world altogether of talking to people, working with people that just deeply care about people and care less about research in and of itself, publishable research specifically, because that used to be the culture. Still is the culture in academia, where publishable research is the main focus, except in a very small number of places where publishable research is not absolutely front and center of how people are valued, like the MITs and Stanfords of the world have a little bit of a leeway in terms of what research goes on and how it's valued, and whether it's published or not is less important. And it's more important to generate value through academic research. But that's not the case in most universities in the world. So I had a completely eye-opening experience at Google where people didn't really care about publishable research. They cared about research. They were researching products. They were researching experiences. And early days of Google, like 2008 Google, when I was an intern there, it was literally the best place to work. I couldn't imagine a better place to work at that time, and I've been in the industry for a while. That was the best times.
And what were some of the things that made it that way? Like what were some of the parts of the culture that helped you really grow and flourish?
I think part of it was my personal transition very quickly from thinking about what I can do for myself to what I can do for others very
Mm.
quickly. Like that, I think I read this book, and I keep referring to that book, Seven Habits of Highly Successful
So
People.
people, yep,
Yeah,
that's right. Stephen
yeah.
Covey.
Covey's book is such a Bible for me.
Mm.
One of the habits is like put yourself in other people's shoes, and as soon as I enter this you know internship, immediately that happened to me. I'm like, hey, this is the first time in my life that I'm working on a piece of code that runs for a billion users. Back in
Wow.
2008, there were a billion, probably a billion user or close to a billion users using Google search every day, and I was working on search. So I was like, I make this change to this code, a billion people are affected by this. Like that was mind boggling, right? And
Yes.
when you do that, then everything else becomes pretty small, like how much money I personally make, even how much I was in the Google Pittsburgh office inside of the Carnegie Mellon University campus. So how much money Google Pittsburgh makes, or CMU makes, or whoever else, like the smaller entities suddenly become less important, and the grand scheme of things suddenly emerge, where the little changes I'm making is impacting people from around the world, 200 countries or whatever. And every day a little bit of my work is showing up in their little mobile phones. Or at that time, like, mobiles were not as big as, like,
Right.
yeah, the
PCs and
desktops
things.
and, yeah, laptops were. Yeah.
So you went to work, you're growing your career at Google. When did you start thinking that you were ready for management?
Yeah, so that happened um very organically. So Google has this concept of a tech lead. A tech
Mm.
lead, it's a much celebrated thing. Like, if you all aspire to become tech leads, even though it's a very fuzzy concept. What is a tech lead? A tech lead is someone that is responsible for the team, but not for the management part of it.
Right.
Like, they build roadmaps for the team. Like, what are you going to work on in the next quarter or next half or whatever, but not how are you doing individually. So there was this gap between, like, what a tech lead did to what a manager did. And at some point in time, I found myself spending so much time with the people I was tech leading that it made sense to just become a manager and support their careers as well. Like, the main difference was I was already caring for their career, but I was not representing their career. I was not going into a performance review session and talking about their. And I had to translate that to their official manager. And I realized that, like, why not cut the middle person and just do it myself. And, like, it was very organic. My managers thought that I was ready. He said, hey, why don't you manage? I had literally had three people in my first team. It was just me and three others. And very honestly, I didn't do a great job as a manager when I first became a manager, but that's a separate story.
Yeah. Well, I think it is difficult because it's interesting that you bring up that Google model because now I've worked at companies outside of Google, never worked inside of Google, but as many companies study the management style, that is a concept that's used outside. And this is how I explain it to people is you first become a lead. That can be a tech lead, that can also be a business lead, where your job is to now divide up the work and deliver the results. But to your point, you don't worry about coaching and managing somebody through their career and all the things around that. And you also don't put money in their pocket or take it out. Those are things that you learn later. And arguably, while those can take less time, as far as like having the annual review or the quarterly review can take, there's less physical time in there, but that takes more skill and you have to be very adept at that. So that does, I would argue, and I'd be curious your thoughts, but it takes time to make some mistakes, understand how to correct that, to really develop a management style that you can relate with and really works.
Yeah, yeah. The classic mistake to what you just said, like, the classic mistake I made was micromanagement. It's
Mm,
like a horrible thing to do, but you don't learn it till it impacts you. So one of the things, this is I'm starting with a failure story, because it's always like the building block to further success is,
that's right.
I had one of the three people on my team, after I got them promoted, left my team.
Mm.
because they were like, okay, you helped my career, but I'm not enjoying working with you.
Ooh.
So that was a fascinating or eye-opening experience where I was like, this is the difference between a tech lead and a tech lead, like a tech lead manager. They're at Google, they call tech lead managers, which is like a manager of a small team, but someone who's very almost like an individual contributor, but with some management responsibilities. I was in that role, and out of three, when one person leaves, that's 33% of your team just gone, and I could not accept it, and I was like completely shattered. But that really helped me understand that there's a huge difference between a tech lead and a manager. To your point, right? Understanding the personal aspects of what inspires, what motivates someone to work was a new thing into as I went into the manager role. So it was pretty interesting.
And so as you started growing, obviously you changed that and you said, I'm going to go correct that. Where did you start getting, management training? And sometimes we get formal management training. Sometimes we find mentors. Sometimes we find peers that are outside of our particular company. How did you start finding resources to grow yourself as a manager?
Yeah, I mean, all my life, again, this varies from person to person. All my life, I've learned through observing others. I observe very keenly every single person's every single step. That's something I'm known for being extremely observant. So often spend a lot of time watching other successful managers. I watched during these performance review sessions. I was paying attention, very close attention to pairwise conversations, to what was resolving problems and what was making the problems worse. Like observing
Interesting.
my peers, my peer
Mm.
managers was one of the best things to do. My manager was also his name is Greg Friedman. He at that time he was my manager, and I learned half of the empathetic management from him.
Oh,
Like he was
interesting.
incredibly empathetic toward everyone. He did not. He really understood where people came from. He was not super deeply technical, but he was super deeply involved in understanding people's psychologies and apply that every day to his management style. And it just was like the fact that someone can be that empathetic was eye opening. I'll say one more thing. One other thing I learned, this was probably right before I became a manager. Google used to have this training called the Edge training. That was also like very eye opening from a learning to manage, learning to work with others. They have I've recently heard that they don't have that anymore, but it was one of those like 3 day experiences in some like place in California, some like isolated place in California where you're hanging out with a bunch of colleagues at Google, and you're doing team building exercises, and you're giving each other very harsh feedback with no prejudice. People you'll not meet again, and I actually didn't meet those people ever again. But we had this like 2 3 hour session where we would each give each other the harshest possible feedback around how we operated with each other during some team building exercises, and that was again such a small thing, so heartbreaking. Like that day I learned things about myself that I'd never observed, because you don't always see yourself in the mirror, you don't always like observe yourself in the third person. So like somebody who has no reason to tell me bad things about myself, so somebody who has nothing to gain or lose telling me this, like, because all our lives we are surrounded by people who have incentives to say things in a certain way, who are that's primarily like you're related to them, you're working with them, they need something from you, you need something from them. Suddenly you're in this isolated place with a bunch of colleagues that you'll never meet again, and they're telling you certain things. I'm like, that is the most honest thing you can do, and you learn so much through that, because and you understand the connection between uh, where people are coming from and what they're saying, the context behind the feedback. And that's also another thing I learned, that context is so important when you give or get feedback, because if somebody has incentive to take your job, replace you with something, their feedback is probably not the best one to take. I actually Mark Zuckerberg, when I was Mark Zuckerberg is a pretty impressive CEO, like from within. One of the things, he gets so much flack externally, but internally he's actually quite respected because he's very direct and honest. One thing that he always says he's extremely criticized, right? Like he's one
Yeah.
of the most he gets a lot of, I mean, he has his follies. I personally have some concerns about that too. But one thing that he says, which is interesting, is he the amount of negative press he gets. He personally says, I don't pay attention to all of them, but I pay attention to the ones where I know that they have good intentions. They want me to
Mm,
succeed. So that actually filters down feedback, and you grow faster because of that.
right. I think that is very insightful, is understanding the context and who's behind it and being able to filter out the stuff that is essentially noise. So as you're growing your career, at some point, to get to Facebook where you're managing larger teams of around 200, at some point you actually start managing managers and really start scaling your team. At what point in your career was that?
I think 20. I did the same thing my manager did to me, which is I turned my tech leads into tech lead managers at Google.
Ah,
So that was the first time, like, I think it was 2017, probably
okay.
6, 7 years back. It was very quick. I actually, like, within a year or two, my team started growing so much that I needed more managers. And I think I found the perfect fit in certain people who wanted to manage and I needed them. So it was mutual. And so I turned them into managers. And I think the process was very interesting because, like, again, my personal experience of failure experiences, um, I saw in them, and and I gave them examples of how the consequences of doing that weren't great. And actually, I thought they sort of took that feedback and moved faster because I was much more like careful about, because I was such a recent manager myself. I was able to like coach them through that recent transition.
I,
Yeah,
I
much more
think
so than my manager. Yeah.
Well, I think that's really powerful is when all of a sudden when you have gone through some of those things recently and it's very real and visceral for you, you can turn around and I think provide that lesson, very quickly to other people. What was as you started scaling your team, did you start getting further from, let's say, the technology and the coding on a day-to-day basis, and how did that feel? I know for myself, as my career grew and I started managing larger and larger teams, it became less about me hands-on in the technology to really guiding, larger impact through the teams. How did that work for you?
Like, if I love the technical aspects of my job so much that it was very hard to give up, actually,
Mm,
for me. And even today, even in today's date, I am so technical that, a lot of my reports tell me they're very surprised because they're not used to managers of large teams that are very technical. Technical to the extent that I'm never satisfied, especially the mathematical and statistical aspects of machine
mm.
learning and AI. I'm so interested in that, and I always find that's where I add value by fixing assumptions people make about, the statistics and probability and the data science aspects, the deeper data science, the mathematical aspects of machine learning and AI. I still continue to do that. One thing I've realized is, like, one thing although I've been coding since I was 8 years old, it wasn't very hard for me to give up coding on a daily basis. What is much harder for me, and I still haven't given up, is when I see something wrong with the design, with software design, or in the case of AI and machine learning, the mathematics and statistics that are used to decide, what is statistically significant, whether the change is meaningful or not, those kinds of things. I get really bothered when my team or my peers brush off, brush, what do you call it? Like, do away with the details because they're presenting to me. I was like, I'm not interested in the high level. I get the high level. I want to see whether you're doing the details right. And 9 out of 10 times, I find flaws in those things. And so I continue to, even today, like yesterday, I had a meeting where I was writing the equation for how to evaluate some things at Databricks, and I really enjoyed, like, and everyone was like, we didn't think of it that way. Okay, that's value. Um, so I have always maintained a dual personality. One where I'm an empathetic leader because empathy is everything in that aspect. The other is as a technical design reviewer, or what do you like a architect. I wouldn't say architect, I would say reviewer of architectures, reviewer of designs. I've definitely switched from doing my work to reviewing other people's work a lot more, and I stay technical through reviews and through inputs in small ways, and draw the line for where I stop contributing and my team starts to take over, because I know that I could keep going, but I think it's very tempting when you're into it. But I have learned the art of like stopping uh, at a point where it's no longer adding value,
Right.
where or it's no it's starting to intrude into my a lot of people, a lot of actually like there's sorry, I'm taking a long, this is
Yeah.
a very good question, to be honest. This is a fantastic question, because like I'm thinking about it all day every day, and I've done so for years. um, One very specific thing that is relevant here is, what if I am too technical, what does it do for my team? How do they feel about that?
Mm,
Actually, a lot of people feel like it's a lack of freedom, because if your manager is constantly technical, then they don't get to be technical themselves. They feel like they have to always like review with you. Like, it creates a culture where, again, the micromanagement
right.
creeps
Can
in.
bleed in. Yeah.
So yeah, so then I have to spend like 9 out of 10 times I have to say, uh, I'm not going to go into the details because I trust you. 1 out of 10 times I'm going to do that. I'm going to use that as a way to demonstrate how
Mm,
how, if you were in my place, how would you review your own work the remaining 9 times. And so that's a good way to like train, but also like maintain a high standards, because we have to balance all
mm.
of these things. Yeah.
We do, and I think this conversation is so important because I do think, and you mentioned before that your mentor slash manager when you were at Google, he was not as much of a technical leader, right? And he may have been more of a business focused leader. And as we continue to grow our careers inside of technology companies, we can grow in different dimensions. We can be a technical leader that's an empathetic manager. We can be a business focused leader that understands the technology. And I think more than anything, it's important to know ourselves, to lead yourself as you are. You're realizing I'm very technical. I could fall down the slope of micromanagement. But in reality, I want to now leverage that, turn that into a superpower that says we need to set standards. And you come from a very unique background, having the PhD in computer science, loving the math. If you get a PhD in computer science, it's less about coding and more about the math and some of those bigger ideas behind it. But I think personally that adds tremendous value to the team, because then you're a coach in that direction. You're coaching them to raise their standards and managing yourself, saying, I'm not going to slip down into micromanagement and do that everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, completely. Like, I think that's exactly it's a great summary of what I was saying. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think about that too, and this is where, as I talk with people today, coach some people today, I try to let them know that understand what type of manager you are, and if you're applying for positions or if you're looking for promotions, be able to describe that to your future manager or who you're interviewing with, so they know what you're going to get. Because I also know there's different leaders out there that are looking for somebody uber technical with a little bit of business, or no, we actually want to be very business focused with a little bit of technical. It's all out there. You just have to know who you are. So as you started growing your career, the one thing we talk about here is equity compensation. I'm curious from yourself, coming from an academic background, you start getting a salary and you're like, okay, this is amazing. I mean, I know for myself, coming out of school, you start making the money and think this is great. At the same time, there is this equity component that gives us so much more, that pegs us to a completely different value as we're working in tech, especially larger tech. What was your journey to learn about equity compensation, and then knowing your value and what to ask for as you got promotions or change companies?
Yeah. Uh, yeah, that's a great question, because this was like we all understood money as graduate students. We like cash basically.
Yes. Yeah.
Not money, cash, right? Like you get cash. Like, oh, you have a bank account, you get a direct deposit every 2 weeks or whatever. And then
Yeah.
suddenly there's this equity thing. It's so much more complex to reason about
Mm,
equity. Suddenly like there's a non-deterministic aspect to compensation where you have to make a decision all the time, or every so often you have to make a decision. Should I sell this stock? And so, first of all, like when I started out, equity was a very small portion of my compensation, as is typical. As you become a bigger and bigger part of a company, equity becomes a much bigger and bigger part of your compensation. This is not new information, most people know this, but also means that you start to own a bigger and bigger part of the company, and so you're accountable for the success of the company in a way that you never felt earlier, because you're just getting your paycheck. Like, how does it matter? I'm a cog in a wheel. But like the a larger piece of equity changes your perception of your own company from feeling like you're a cog in a wheel to a much more a more stronger driver of like the company's success. Especially now that I've one thing you may have noticed is I've progressively worked at smaller and smaller companies. Like Facebook, when I joined, was about 20,000 people. When I left, was 100,000. Now it's 180 or 190,000. It's crazy. Facebook, when I joined, it was 30,000. When I left, and before that, rounds of layoffs, it was 88,000 people, and then layoffs brought it down to something in the 60,000s. Still very big. Databricks is in the mid 10, like 5,000, 6,000. I don't know exact numbers, in that range, right? Much smaller company, like six to 7,000. I don't know exact numbers, but now suddenly you are a bigger player in a smaller company. So it has a very direct connection suddenly to like equity, because you are owning a bigger percentage of the company as your career grows, a bigger percent of a smaller company, so even bigger relative to the size of the company. So the equity compensation, one thing I realized was that it increasingly becomes a gamble, but you have to make intelligent guesses about the success. So you have to do your own research about equity, your evaluation, the future potential of this company. Like when I was deciding between with the compensation at Databricks, for example, the obvious comparison point for me was, first of all, how does it compare directly with my Facebook compensation? But also, if I project to the future, how does the compensation look like if I believe in this company, if I believe in this vision? So that's something I did quite a bit as I was, projecting future income at Databricks. I was like, I really believe in the mission of this company. I really believe that this company will do amazing. It got into AI before AI was big.
mm,
Like if you look at Ali Ghosh, our CEO, who's by the way pretty amazing. If you hear his conversation from like 4 or 5 years back, he literally is saying this before anyone else. I mean, some people are, but he's
right.
particularly saying data and companies that do data and AI are going to win. And 4 years down the line, uh, everyone is a data, like focusing on data and AI actually.
That's right.
So he was ahead of everyone. So that's why I believe in his vision, and I believe that he can get it right with his predictions of the futures. That's why I was like, I'm going to use that projection of the future of equity for a late stage startup to decide, and it made complete sense for me to move. Yeah.
And some of the things you said there are so important that people think about when they are looking at companies to go to work for. And that you have to have your own thesis. You have to do your due diligence on the company. And this is, one of the what I advocate for is you need to think like an investor. You're investing your time and talent that you could be continuing to remain at a
Absolutely.
company where if it's public, at least you're getting you're getting liquidity, you're getting additional capital coming in the form of equity as compensation versus now you're going to a pre-IPO company. Obviously, it's a unicorn. I think it could be traded today on a secondary market, so there could be some liquidity options. But you have to have a thesis. I also think that your career it was this similar to mine, and there is a pattern there that I've seen with a lot of other executives where they go to work for public companies first and understand, what do successful public companies look like. Then when you have that framework and you understand from a management perspective, from a operations perspective, setting standards perspective, then when you go and you start selecting companies to go to work for that are pre-IPO, you're already going to have a filter that can filter out a lot of things that you don't want, because you realize that doesn't have, and some of it can be very quantitative, and some of it could be more qualitative, where it's like, this doesn't have the feel of success. Something's not right here. Versus you looked at Databricks, you started seeing all the indicators that said, okay, this number one fits my thesis, but you're also looking at the team members, the way that they're communicating, I'm sure, saying, okay, I can see being an owner in this company and us being successful with where we want to go.
Yeah, yeah, it goes both ways, right? They're also investing in people like me who have worked at public companies and who have basically understood the success paradigms, and also they're also betting on, like, the equity packages are pretty strong at these levels, right? So
Yeah.
they're also using their precious limited equity abilities, like, to compensate people like me who have worked at public companies, because they want us to bring in some of the, like, the rigor that we see in more mature companies. So it works both ways. Yeah.
It does. And that to me is, then that's your leverage. Your leverage is the more you can articulate your story, what you've delivered at Google, what you've delivered at Facebook, even some of the training and how you've been focused on this AI space, the length of time you've been there. That's all, as you sit down at the negotiating table, that's all leverage that shows them, here's the value that I can bring to the table, but allows you to also ask for what you're worth.
Yeah, yeah, and I definitely, I mean, now I'm in the process of hiring people, and I find it, like, at Databricks, and a lot of people actually do that. They actually, when they have a conversation with me and they're trying to get a job, a lot of times they're actually pitching themselves in a way that I have not seen in the past. Like, earlier, they would just, like, type in there, like, oh, the Databricks is an incredibly high bar company. So, like, I've never seen a company of this high bar of technical talent for technical talent. I don't know about the other functions. Like, all the people who have, like, done really well and I thought were amazing are getting rejections left
Wow.
and right. It's so then I think, like, my point is that I it's become very, very, like, oh, it's not enough to write code. Like, these candidates are now trying to sell themselves and saying, hey, here's what I can bring to the table. And I think that's actually a winning strategy when they do it tastefully. It shouldn't be cringe, but they
Right.
should, like, try to sell themselves to companies that are competitive and have more candidates, many, many more qualified candidates that they can hire. Then your differentiator becomes, how do you sell to the company beyond just being able to show that you're technically strong.
Yeah, and that's into. I guess what I'm hearing is I know when I was at Splunk, and Splunk was post IPO and we were growing, we had a very similar scenario. And what I found would differentiate people is a lot of people could walk in the door and tell you what they did, and they could say that, and that was very interesting, but they couldn't tell you, so what? Meaning they could say, here's what I do, but they can't articulate the results that they delivered. And at a company like Databricks, that's what they're looking for, is not just somebody who has built the widget, but somebody who's built the widget, put that inside of the machine, and understood the goals of the company to be able to align it to that and win. They're looking for that extra bit that people can articulate, because that's what's going to make a good company owner, because that's what you're coming in as.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, completely agree with that. Yeah.
And so going back to what you said before, in that you're now working for smaller and smaller companies to get more and more equity. Was that a strategy that you had been focused on, or was that something that's just happening organically?
I didn't have a very. I'll be honest with you. I don't have a very ambitious money plan, to be
Mm.
really honest with you. I don't have a very organized way of thinking about how much money I want to make. I have some targets for for the future, but it's not super. It's nothing like some of the other people. I know someone who said they have 12 different money managers that they work with. And you know how many money
Whoa.
managers I work with? Zero. I manage my own money. I do my own taxes. I'm far simpler in that sense, right? Like I'm
Right.
not a very. I'm reasonably technical to be able to understand the tax code and be able to file my taxes. Even though with all the equity taxation, I mean, buying and selling homes has become a nightmare for taxation. But I did it. But like at the same time, I didn't have a lot of clear strategy around like, oh, here's what my trajectory will look like if I went to
Mm.
a pre-IPO company. Here's what it would look like if I continued. My decision for careers have been far more been about what I find it interesting.
Yep.
But I won't recommend that to everyone. I'm so passionate about technology, and I can go so deep that that's the joy I get on a daily basis. Money is secondary to me in that sense, but it is also really important because it changes lifestyles. It allows you to retire early and all of that. I understand that, but I've not personally not been. I'm not saying I'm very proud of this. I'm just saying that I'm not very organized when it comes to managing my money or creating a career strategy around money. My career strategy has always been around how is my biggest thing, which is uh, a little bit different from all of these, is how is my day to day. And I learned this from my one of my managers at Facebook. He used to always tell me like you should optimize for a few different things, and one of them has to be how is your day to day. Would you take a pay cut to have a better day to day? And I always used to say yes. But effectively, I have by joining a pre-IPO company, I have taken a pay cut. Not on paper. On paper, I haven't taken a pay cut. But in terms of cash that comes in on a weekly basis, I'm not getting those like Facebook stocks that I used to get, right? Because and get sell them immediately and all of that. That strategy doesn't work. But my day to day is the main thing I use to determine my career path. To be really honest with you, yeah.
Well, and that's okay. I mean, I think it's people are looking for an opportunity to ultimately pursue their passions, right? And some people feel that the corporate environment where you're getting a paycheck and ultimately working for somebody else can be too stifling, so they want to use it as a tool to get to somewhere else where they can pursue their passions. But ultimately, some people do love technology. When you work in those companies, you get a front row seat to the future. And that's an exciting part to be of every day. And then when you're working with a team that's excited and is highly technical and you're building great product, there's it's very similar to operating, I think, in other functions at very high level of performance, right? You think about F1, Formula One, big technical winning things. I mean, you win on the technical field as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm glad you said that because one thing that's been common throughout my career is working on bleeding edge stuff everywhere I've been. Is I like every time I've worked on something, I've like looked around like who else is doing this. I'm like no one is doing this thing that I am doing at this scale, or this no one is doing this thing. Period. So I've been very fortunate to have always worked in areas where I just my day to day hap- is good because of the work that I'm doing, and even if I ignore everything else about my career, but that's yeah. And one of the things I'll just add that one of the things I've found to be a recipe for success for people who want to make a lot of money, people who want to like to your podcast theme, right?
Yes.
To be successful, I find that some of the people who make the most money are the ones who did not focus on money for at least some period of time in their career, where they were like they developed their skills and their abilities and their their passion to the extent where like they became so employable in some sense that people were competing for their talent because they're like people talk about especially senior leaders, people talk about people all the time, how is this person, should we get this person, should we get that person? It will be amazing if we can hire that person. Oh, this person will completely come in and change the way we work on things. That conversation, people need to have that conversation about you, and that's when you start then you do the interview, and then you're great, and then they're so desperate to have you, then they have that leverage to like ask for more money or whatever, like, equity or whatever. And then they will oblige if you're that good. If they and if you're like moderate, then you suddenly hit a ceiling for how much negotiation power you have.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. And if you focus a part of your career on looking for the opportunities to deliver results, finding passionate people to work with that will help you build those deep skills, that's what I call your career capital. And that's going to give you leverage later on. And I think that the first part of your career, if you focus on building the career capital, you can then go on and leverage it. I didn't start working for significant equity till 10 years of my career into my career, because to your point, I was focused on how do I build skills? How do I do great work? And to your point, be on that bleeding edge versus seeking the money. And then ultimately the money came, because then you have that in the bag, and then you can start making very interesting choices of where you want to work.
Yeah, and essentially what you're doing by doing what you just said is you're moving yourself to the extreme edge of the curve of like skill, like how rare is your skill set.
Right.
As you move more and more toward the rareness, you're like the supply demand, the standard microeconomic theory kicks in of like
Yeah.
supply and demand, and at some other time there's not enough supply for the kind of skills you have, and so it very directly translates into how much money you can make, because ultimately this is it's a market, like employment is a market, it's a marketplace like any other
It is.
marketplace. Yeah.
And the more rare and valuable you can be, the better you can have those conversations when it comes to compensation and equity.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. We're going to take a break right now, and we're going to come back afterwards, and we're going to dig into a couple things. I want to dig into the double down strategy, and we'll talk a little bit about that for career growth. And then I want to pick your brain as somebody who is in the AI and ML space as far as how that's going to change the workplace going forward. We'll be right back. All right. And we are back here with the second half with Ritendra Datta. And Ritendra thinks about career in a way that I think is refreshing. I think it's important for us to listen to what he has to say. And he wrote a very interesting Medium article on the double down strategy that I think has enough quantitative information and qualitative information that helps us think about promotions in a completely different way. Can you give us a high level of the double down strategy?
Yes. So I think like it's the very simple idea that there's a very specific thing around career growth and doubling down in that article, but at a high level this is about taking much more ownership of your career. And this is there are many such strategies which can accelerate your career. This specific one was more around the mindset of growth, because like 9 out of 10 times like people don't really like think about beyond their next like when they think about promotions, they think about their next promotion only, because that's how we've always been taught to think. But the problem with that is, like, I have a graph in that article, but it's basically the idea that your skill sets need to, you need a longer time to build skills for the next promotion.
Yes.
If you don't start now, and your clock starts as soon as you are ready. Your clock doesn't start after you got your next promotion. So if
That's
your
right.
next skill set requires 2 years, or let's say 3 years, and your next promotion is 1 year down the line, so by one strategy where you don't focus at all on your next promotion, or promotion is a more specific way of representing like a career jump in some
Yes.
sense, right? There's a broader sense of this that's not very specific to the notion of, you get to level n+1, which is a specific invention of corporate America. It's the more general concept here is like you do bigger and greater things, and in order to do bigger and greater things, you need to like have developed new skill sets that didn't have in your previous level, right? So yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, let's go back to the example that we had earlier. I think it's very
Yeah,
salient. So we
yeah,
talked about team lead and then team lead manager. And we talked about to get to a team lead, you're really managing work. You're saying, I'm going to get a big piece of work. I'm going to carve it up. I'm going to give it to the team as a lead. And then I'm going to focus on that result coming back. And I'm going to roll that up to my manager. I'm not managing their career. I'm not mentoring them on sort of how they do or team interactions. And I'm not putting money in and out of their pocket. Now, that's if I'm in one, I'm thinking, okay, how do I get to a team lead? You're working on this, the work breakdown structure and getting it back. However, if you're thinking, doubling down and you're thinking beyond that, you're going to think the newest person who comes in on the team, let me work on some of my mentorship skills. And I heard you say this when you became the team lead, you all of a sudden started working on mentorship and doing other things that prepped you for the team lead manager. And that is really the double down strategy where you're looking at the next role and saying, what's the skill I need to stack on? If I start stacking that on before I get my first promotion, I'm now getting that runway of developing that skill, hardening it. And what I like about this double down strategy is that creates actually much more sustainable careers because we have to stack these skills, right? The skills that you have now have been stacked over years and years from where you were when you walked in the door at the intern. And if you just tried to onboard to the skills you have today, it wouldn't happen because you definitely need time. You need to have experiences. You need to have successes. You need to have failures. So the sooner we can look towards our career and understand what we want and start adopting that now, that will allow us to, I think, grow our career more sustainably. That's what I thought was the interesting part of your thesis.
yeah, yeah. I think there's a broader version of exactly like that example was super classic. Like, these are not technically promotions. IC, individual
Right.
contributor, to tech lead manager. As an IC, if you behave like both the tech lead and a tech lead manager without having those titles, both of those will come to you sooner than you think. If you start to think about management only after you've become a tech lead, then you've already lost a bunch of time. But what if you, from day one, no one will call you a manager from day one, but what if you behave like one? Then they'll see that in you. And that's the strategy in action, where everyone starts to think of you as a natural manager for that team, and so that just works out. Similarly, like, when you do this double down strategy at a much bigger scale, again, I learned this from one of my managers. Like, when you're running a 10-person company, an organization, most people will think, okay, how do I scale this to 100 people? But my manager said, how do you scale this to 1,000 people? Like, from 10 to 1,000 seems like a huge jump, but it's really your sky. It's all in your head, how limited you want to be. Like, you can still go and observe those VPs that are running 1,000 or senior vice presidents that are running 1,000+ person orgs. Like, what do they do? How do they scale? You can start to observe them. Like, nothing prevents you from thinking really big, but
Right.
not necessarily immediately getting there. So that's overlapping, that graph, the timeline overlaps, where you're building all sorts of skills in the same time. You're not going to get those promotions, or not going to get to run 1,000-person orgs right away, but you're ahead of everyone in your peer group who are not doing that, because
Right.
you started training for it before
Yeah.
everyone else. Yeah.
You started getting in repetitions. What are some of the common mistakes that you're seeing early stage engineers or early stage engineering managers making that are really avoidable?
Not paying attention to communication
Mm,
skills, written, verbal. I think a lot of people in tech in America are not native English speakers,
mm,
but they just, instead of trying to figure something do something about it. They just like focus on the things they're good at. Like we all tend to focus on what we're good at. Like that's a very common thing for
Yes.
it's human nature for us to
Yeah.
do the things we are good at, because we get more and more appreciation. We get addicted to that feedback loop of like getting more appreciation for what you're already good at, and not venture into things that you're not good at, because it's a painful process to like expose yourself to something that you're not good at, and then having a period where you're not appreciated for this new thing,
Yes,
right? So
that's right.
I think but then like, what if you started with written communication, which is much
Hmm.
easier to pick up, and then just got really good at it, so that you don't speak much, but everything you write about your technical work is immediately parsable by everyone, and people start like looking up to you. So that's number one. Number two is being very for especially for managers, this is a huge mistake, which is focusing too inward. What does my team get to do? What is my scope? What is, like,
Hmm.
how do I benefit from this? A lot of managers make the mistake of exposing their personal desires a little too quickly, because I mean we all aspire to grow. Like there's no
Right.
there's no secret. Like we are humans, everyone gets it, right? But when you're blatantly doing things that make you look selfish, oh, I
Yes.
want this for my team, I want this scope, I want that, I think it really makes people think this person is gonna grow up to be a politician, and they're gonna like continue to fight for scope, and not, sometimes they would do that at the expense of the company's well-being. So ultimately, like,
Hmm.
for especially for technical leaders and managers to come across as being company focused, putting company before yourself and even your team, um, then suddenly, like, if you're able to project that, then people see people trust you with more and more, because they don't see you as too strongly tied to you, the little world that you live in, right? So again, to repeat, like, for especially for ICs, but also obviously important for managers, um, being a great communicator in whatever form of communication that is universally parsable. It doesn't have to be verbal. It can be written. It can be, you know, I don't know. Maybe there are other ways to do it, but typically it's between verbal and written. Um, and then the second one is about not being too selfish and inward focused, especially when you communicate with your leadership team, especially communicate with your peers. You want to come across as, I want to do the right thing for the company.
That's
And
right.
I think you want to believe that. Like, again, this really ties back to the earlier thing you said about equity compensation. Like, as
Yes.
you start to as you start to get more and more, uh, as your compensation starts to get more and more tied to the equity of your company, you ought to start to think in terms of the company, because your finance is not tied to your personal team's contributions alone. It starts to get more and more tied to the whole company's success. So you ought to think in terms of, if there's a competition going on between you and some other teams for some scope, for some, this is, by the way, this is happening in every company in
Oh, yeah,
AI.
yes, yes.
Inside of everyone wants a seat at the table when it concerns AI, and there's internal fights going on around these things in every company in the whole world. I'll end there, because I think that can get that's a different conversation. But
Well,
my point is about not being selfish. Yeah.
not being selfish, yeah. And I think, the communication is so important because nobody's going to tell your story for you. And I'm sure you've seen this too. And this also goes to the career growth as well. If you believe that you're going to get to a director, a manager, a head of a function, and you don't have to tell stories and you don't have to communicate succinctly, you're wrong, because storytelling, communication becomes so important because we're communicating up all the time, justifying budget, discussing why things are delayed, or if we need things from other teams, we need to be able to articulate that clearly. And so communication is absolutely critical. And then thinking like an owner of the company and focusing most on, what is the company focused on? The customer? If so, then we all need to be aligning to what the company wants, because that's ultimately going to allow this asset to grow in value that benefits us arguably more than the paycheck.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll just say one thing. Exactly what you said. You summarized it well. I think the ultimately we are all serving ourselves and our close, loved ones and whatnot. So it just changes the time horizon,
Yeah.
right? Like basically, like if you're fighting for the company, ultimately you're still serving yourself. It's not altruistic in any way.
Right.
You are just making a better financial decision for the long term for you and your family in some sense by focusing on the company. So it's like it's somewhat myopic to think that you'll make a little bit more money, get that next promotion or whatever. But what if you just really cared about the company? Then you suddenly your company is so much more successful that the leverage is much higher with that.
Right. So I do want to take the conversation towards the direction of AI and this, very powerful tool set that's entering companies and engineering teams right now. What what are you seeing? How are you seeing this play out? Not just at Databricks, but I'm sure that you have your ear to the ground in other companies as well. How do you see this, benefiting teams? What do you see some of the risks?
So first of all, like I've seen AI in companies for 14 years now, right?
Yeah.
So it's just gone mainstream more recently thanks to OpenAI and ChatGPT's phenomenal growth. And basically, like it became a household thing because the generative AI in particular. I mean, in my world, I have two kinds of AI, right? Like supervised. I mean, there are multiple. There's a smaller group of other kinds, but like, yeah, but the big ones are supervised learning, which is machine learning. That is basically saying, if I give you this data point, can you tell me which category or what number it maps to? Right. That's the basic, overly simplistic version of supervised AI. And then there's generative AI, where you're giving a prompt and you're getting a lot of content back. Like it's no longer just saying yes or no, for 0 or 1.5. It's actually giving you. So I think it's caught the generative AI portion of AI has caught the fascination of people because that's the AI we grew up watching in Hollywood. Like supervised AI is super important but boring. Like, oh, can you tell if this is a picture of a cat or a dog? Like, how do you even like? It's important because every single day a Google search is powered by thousands of such classification decisions, right? Or even like if you're using Gmail, the spam filtering is one of the most powerful AI pieces that improves your life on a daily basis, but no one talks about it, right? Like spam filtering is leaps and bounds ahead of the Yahoo Mail or Hotmail days, where we were full of spam and like only so you had to really filter. Like you're literally wasting some chunk of your time every day sifting through a bunch of email. Now these newer email clients are just like classifying all the emails into categories, and it really helps you focus on what's important, saving you a ton of time. But no one talks about that. That's like the kind of AI that I grew up on. But then I also was working generative AI for discrimination. It's a different topic. Like generative AI was also being used when I was in grad school. I actually built generative models like 14 years, 15 years back, not for the purpose of generating text, but for explaining things. Because there's this idea that if you generate something, then you have the best view of the world, and then using that generation, then you can tell the difference, then you can do supervised classification and anyway, that's a separate topic. Coming back to your question about like how I'm seeing this play out, I'm not an expert to talk about the whole industry and how everyone is doing it. From my like personal viewpoint, I'm seeing a lot of noise in this space. That is like people are very worried about what is going to happen if they don't jump on the AI bandwagon, but they don't know what it is. They're somewhat clueless. Like there's not enough experts out there to explain to them which part of this AI boom is valuable. The funny thing is everyone wants to do generative AI, but a lot of companies haven't even gone through the process of doing supervised classification of the things that would make their daily lives immediately better. They go straight to generative AI because chat GPT. And they I hope eventually this thing rationalizes to the point where AI, the broader umbrella of AI itself, becomes a much used technology in every single company. Some of it is generative, some of it is discriminative, which means that in some AI is just deciding do you do this, do you do that? That's just super useful. And then you also use generative AI to write your presentations, improve your company's documentation. You're writing those documentations using a lot of context from within your company. And the other thing that I think generally companies don't realize is how much data they're sitting on. Each company is sitting on a gold mine of data that they could use for both discrimination and generation of content, uh, which I think when consultants start to uh, cons- knowledgeable consultants start to talk to these companies, they're going to start to tell them, hey, I'm so glad you're paying attention to AI. Thank you for paying attention to this that you ignored for a decade.
Yes.
By the way, by the way, do the simple thing first and then go into this more complex thing. And I think it'll start to like play out in a very meaningful way where everyone is going to benefit from AI, but the catalyst was something, but the outcome was something else. I think that's how it's going to play out for the next 5 years, and then eventually, I have not really thought deeply about like how this is going to evolve over a very long time horizon.
Right.
But over the next 3 to 5 years, the attention it's basically like Apple released the iPhone, everyone started building mobile phone based applications, but they also started building for Android, they started building for BlackBerry, they started like so the catalyst was one thing, but it impacted the broader ecosystem is how I see it. Yeah.
Well, and I think you're bringing to life some of the stuff that I've been hearing from other people too, and I think it's important to have somebody with your experience talk about this. Is we're in that phase where I call this more of the excitement and wonder phase, and that can turn to a little concern and worry. The reality is, we're just, especially on the generative AI side, just trying to understand the value that it can bring to the table, and this technology needs to mature and needs some time to harden and mature over the next couple of years to really become useful.
Yep, yep, exactly. And I think it will happen. I think it's just a matter of time. And like, I think again, there'll be a cascading set of companies and their timelines of when they get there. Mature companies like Google in particular, like Google built all of this before everyone else
Mm,
at scale. They were very careful about releasing all these things because they're always under scrutiny, they don't want to mess things up. So but compare that to like some traditional bank, for example, right? Their time horizon starts now.
right. Yeah.
And they're just gonna have to accelerate to the point where they're competitive with the more technical banks that they're
Mm.
competing with, right?
Okay, so that's a good point to tease out. It's the companies that haven't been incorporating this into their tech stack are going to need to start exploring and figuring out what are the 1, 2, 3 steps they need to be taking now, because in 4 or 5 years, the companies that have been working on it are going to now be at a completely different level of maturity.
Yeah. And like a classic example I think of is Capital One versus like a lot of these
Mm,
smaller credit unions. Like, or I'm sure there are other banks also like that are not very technical. And like Capital One was technical way before all of these other companies. They had like AI teams and data science teams before all these other companies. I think so. I'm not an expert at this, but what I know is that uh, Capital One was ahead in that banking space from a technological perspective, and the other companies, if they want to compete, they have to catch up very quickly, and they have to do that in an accelerated timeline because otherwise, like the gap will just keep increasing or
right.
stay constant. They have to bridge the gap, right?
And yeah, and try and accelerate its closure. Interesting. So then, do you see any immediate impacts, or I'd say like in the next 12 to 24 months, and just in the general workspace, in tech around generative AI?
Yeah, I think the way people are talking about this is, again, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I agree with this vision, which is that AI is not going to take people's jobs, but people who are used employees who are uh, getting the assistance, maximizing the assistance from generative AI are going to outperform those that are not doing that.
Mm,
It's a safe thing to say because it's like less controversial, like AI is taking our jobs, but Like all it says is it's everyone should start to use AI in their world,
Right.
in however they work, incorporate that into their process, so that everything they do is just better. And when everyone else is doing that, you start to like your actual progress slows down. Imagine like the difference between writing a, let's say you're tasked with, you're a tech writer for a company, you're tasked with writing a documentation for a new feature your company is building. Like that's your job. Now, um, between two such people, the person that starts out with a draft from some kind of large language model like Llama or OpenAI or Mistral or Mosaic's models, you end up with a reasonable first draft. And then iterating, tweaking it, getting the facts right, removing hallucinations, and all of that is 10x faster. Similarly with co-programmers, if you start with a draft of some, you describe something you want to solve, and these LLMs generate some code for you, and then you like realize, oh, there's a bug here, and this is not exactly what. Again, 10x. So people are generating content, generating code. All of them need to start using generative AI immediately. Otherwise, they're immediately gonna their counterparts are gonna get a get a head start. And so, but unfortunately, what I think it also means is that there will be fewer jobs in the down the line in the creative space, because I this is my guess, is like if if you could do everything, if you do everything 10x faster, but the demand is not 10x more,
Mm,
something's got to give, right? Like if everyone's 10x more productive but the need is only 2x more, then there's a gap that's created,
they're
which
right. There's
yeah,
essentially you have more productive people that are out there that are able to fill more of the gap versus those that don't. And what I'm hearing very clearly is it's important for all of us to start learning and adopting to generative AI right now,
yeah,
to essentially stay ahead of the curve, right? And
yeah,
don't get behind the gap.
yeah. And I have a very specific example, and I'm heartbroken basically because I have lots of recruiter friends, people
Mm,
in tech recruiting. A lot of them have lost jobs recently. It's just heartbreaking to see this. Like, uh, so much of that. That's not generative AI, but that's like AI, broader AI of like just sifting through resumes, filtering them down.
mm,
Like those, a lot of these jobs are sort of getting replaced by some kind of AI agent that is doing this at scale, and companies are okay with missing out on some good candidates because
mm,
they're sifting through them, they're getting a few good ones, they're missing out on a few good ones, but they tolerate that. The saving that they make out of swapping
mm,
humans for AI based sourcing is so much
interesting.
more compelling that they just don't need that many sources, they don't that need that many recruiters, and every single company is I know of has had some kind of recruiting layoff, or people operations layoffs of some kind,
Interesting.
which is pretty heartbreaking. But like it also means that certain categories of jobs are just gonna be less needed. Like the supply demand curve across the spectrum of different types of jobs is going to shift because
Right.
of AI. I think that's the most meta thing I can say about the question that you, which is, I gave some specific examples, but I think what you're saying is there's going to be a shift in distribution between supply and demand.
Yeah, there's going to be a shift in distribution, and the more that you can adopt this new technology and understand where you can build skills and where you can play a role, I think is important because more than anything, we working in technology, we have to constantly stay ahead of it, stay current to try to get ahead so that we can understand where the opportunity is.
Yep. Yep.
Well, thank you for that. Before we go, we usually wrap up with a fire round. So I'm going to ask you 5 questions right now, just some crisp, succinct answers, and we'll get out of here. Okay. So, what is the worst career advice you've ever received?
Fight for your scope.
Ooh, fight for your scope. That goes against what you said earlier. Number 2, how do you keep learning?
Just keep your eyes and ears open everywhere you go. Treat every moment of your life as a learning opportunity,
Mm,
because everything you learn is transferable.
that's huge. What do you do to recharge your batteries?
I am a filmmaker and a theater director and a screenwriter. I I get huge amounts of relaxation from storytelling and just watching great movies as well, because that's where I also get ideas. So that's a really nice feedback loop.
Oh, that's great. What's the advice you give your younger self in tech?
Uh, don't obsess over details. Get the big picture right as soon as possible, and
Mm,
use a top down strategy in even the most detailed little things that you do, because it's very easy to lose the reference frame of
mm.
what you're doing within the grand scheme of things, and that's something that changes the way you do everything.
And finally, what soft skill has helped your career the most?
Storytelling and communication, because that's something that I've also said earlier, is that changes the way people perceive you. Whether it's fair or not, I don't know, but it does change people's perception. Like people who speak most succinctly, even
Mm.
when they overhear that from someone else who did all the work, people then go to that person in the future instead of the person who did the work. It's an unfair advantage to be good at communication, but
It really is. And I think more and more people need to understand that. Well, Ritendra, I can't thank you enough for your time. I've taken a lot away from this, and I know everybody else has too. I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
thank you so much for having it. It was such a fascinating conversation. A lot of questions required me to think a lot, rethink a lot of thoughts I had earlier. Yeah.
Well, appreciate it. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today with Ritendra. I hope you got a ton of value from it. I do want to ask you one thing. If you want more insights around career and what's happening in the job market, what are the skills that you need to learn? Also, what are some key fundamental skills that we need to build as we're growing our wealth? I would ask that you subscribe to Tech Career and Money News. That's right, techcareersandmoneynews.com is our latest offering, which is a publication that comes out weekly that gives you a lot of insights around career, money, and what is happening when it comes to equity compensation and the companies that you want to work for. Please subscribe now.